Do a conventional deadlift if you've got self-respect. Do a sumo deadlift if you want to lift the most weight. Alright, so rolling? Yeah. Hey, we are coaches at PCHC Mulgrave. I'm Hugh, this is Chris, and today we're going to be talking a bit about deadlifting. Sumo versus conventional. What are the main differences you see between them, and when you might want to do one or the other?
So what are the main differences between a sumo and a conventional deadlift? Well, in a sumo deadlift, I think the thing that people see the most or see first is the fact that there is a shorter range of motion, and this is because we have our feet in a wider position, and a shorter range of motion can sometimes allow us to lift more weight because the weight simply doesn't have to travel quite as far. The next advantage is that in a sumo deadlift, because our knees are in a more outer position and because our hips are a little bit more open or more abducted and externally rotated, this also affords us the ability to achieve a more upright position. And this more upright position puts our back in a position where there's just less stress on the upper and lower back.
So one of the other considerations is, can you actually get into a good position, either conventional or sumo deadlift? In the conventional deadlift, some people are going to be limited by their hip flexions, the amount that they can bend at the hip without also having to bend at the spine. So some people who have trouble with that are going to find it very hard to get into a neutral-ish, flat-ish looking position down the bottom of the conventional deadlift, and may find it easier in the sumo deadlift because it doesn't require as much hip flexion. However, there are other requirements in the sumo deadlift which some people have trouble with as well, which is your hip abduction, how much you can push your knees outwards, and how much you can externally rotate your femur, so turning that upper thigh bone outwards. And so if you're very good at those things, you might find that sumo is very effective for you, but if that's very limited, might be that conventional suits you more initially. Both of these things can be improved through training and through time, but these are the initial considerations for what might suit you better.
So the final thing we need to note in terms of the differences between the sumo and the conventional deadlift is simply the muscles used in each lift, and which are more sort of prominent, or the differences between the muscles used. In the sumo deadlift, because we are in that more upright position with our knees out, what we'll find is that not only are our knees out, but our knees are also a little bit more forwards. And with that position comes a little bit more quad that we need to use to actually come out of that position. Another thing we'll see is that because our knees are in that, or our hips are in that more adducted position, our knees are sort of pushed outwards, our knees actually have to come in to some degree to actually help us lift the weight. And so our adductors themselves, on the inside of our thighs, will actually have to adduct and help contribute to the lift as well, compared to a conventional where your knees are just coming straight forwards and your hips are a little bit more further back.
So we've discussed a couple of the differences between the two stances, and in summary, essentially it's going to be what you've got the mobility for and suits your relative strengths is going to probably be where you're strongest to begin with and where is most natural for you. No reason not to do both. That's of course going to be the conclusion here, is that it's worth trying either one. But essentially, if you have issues with your hip flexion, you're not very strong there, or not very mobile there, then you'll find sumo to be more natural for you. And if you have issues with your abduction and external rotation, then probably conventional will be a little bit more natural for you. For a lot of people, if you can get into a good sumo position, a lot of the time that lessened range of motion, greater uprightness, is going to result in a larger weight moved, but that is not the case for everyone.
So in terms of which one you should pick, it depends on two main factors. Number one is goals, and number two is preference. So in terms of goals, if your goal is to lift as much weight as possible, then the sumo deadlift might work a little bit better for you. That is assuming you have adequate hip range of motion. This is because, as we talked about previously, the sumo deadlift allows you to assume a more upright position and also allows you to cut the range of motion. This is not the case for everyone. Not everyone's going to be stronger despite the cut of range of motion, despite the fact that it is easier on your lower back or upper back as well. However, for some people, this will be the case.
So Chris just talked about performance being one of your goals, but let's say that's not your goal. Let's say that hypertrophy is your main goal, or at least an important goal to you. Range of motion at the joints is something that's important for your hypertrophy. So in a sumo deadlift, a well-executed one, someone with advantageous levers for it, you're going to find that the range of motion at pretty much all joints is quite small, and that's ideal for performance. However, for maximum hypertrophy, we're probably going to want a little bit more range of motion at our joints that we're trying to work the muscles across them. So most of the time we're going to find a conventional deadlift will be superior to a sumo deadlift for hypertrophy, but at the same time, a conventional deadlift, you can lift a lot of weight, and it does require a lot from your back, which is not necessarily what you're trying to target. So other alternatives like a Romanian deadlift, where you can isolate those hip muscles a bit more, might be advantageous if hypertrophy is what you want more than anything else.
And while you can possibly argue that the sumo deadlift can train your quads more, compared to a conventional, like this is probably not the best option for you if you're trying to target your quads. There's simply better exercises you can pick, which train your quads through a larger range of motion, and because of this fact, you can put more tension on the muscles and ultimately stimulate more growth. An example of this might be like an actual barbell squat, or maybe something like a split squat.
So last thing to consider before we talk about just doing it because you feel like doing it is your injury history. So if you've got aches and pains in various parts, your hips don't like being abducted, you might find that you quite like being in a more adducted position doing a conventional deadlift. Or you might find that if your back gives you trouble when you're more hinged over, there's more demands on your spinal erectors or those various joints, you might find the more upright position of the sumo suits you better. And that will become obvious if you try those things and you've got some of those ailments. The other thing is just doing what you like to do. Some people just prefer how one stance feels, even if they could train the other one for some period of time, 6 months or so, and end up being stronger there. If they just like doing the other one, that is a very important thing because you do the training that you want to do, more or less. So enjoyment with your stance is important as well.
And the final thing to really consider is that you don't have to do just one or the other. You can use each one as sort of variation to supplement your training. Say you do a sumo deadlift, you can still use a conventional deadlift maybe on an alternate day, simply to train the muscles through a large range of motion, or just to train some of the muscles that you train less on the sumo deadlift. So if you want to train your upper back more or your lower back more, a conventional deadlift can be a good option for that. Same with if you do a conventional as your primary deadlift. If you want to do some more deadlifting, but you can't tolerate the amount of stress that the conventional deadlift puts through your back, maybe pulling some sumo on the alternate day is a good option for you to accumulate more deadlift volume without actually having to stress your back quite as much.
In conclusion, with all of that, all of those things said, all those comparisons, all those considerations, just try both. If you can, try both. It's worth being proficient in both of them to find out what you like, what you're strong at. It's worth having the skills, the motor patterns, the mobility to be in those positions. And it means that if things change, because you're not the same lifter now as you will be in a year, 5 years, so on, it's worth having some of that foundation, a broad foundation. Specializing too soon into only doing one stance, only one particular thing, is usually not as good for your development as being broadly skilled. So try both.
If you want to.
If you want to. So, Chris, the viewers want to know, they've been telling me, they've been nagging me, Chris, is deadlifting sumo cheating?
Well, short answer is no. Like, if you're talking about in the context of powerlifting, in pretty much every single federation, like, you're allowed to pull sumo, so in that way, no. Most people also pull sumo, like maybe 70% of powerlifters, so again, no. Yeah, no.
Oh, well, in that case, let me ask you one very important question.
Yeah.
If you had to deadlift conventional, would you deadlift as much?
No, I wouldn't. But, I mean,